comprehend Song of War. In today's video, we are going to deal with the real anticlimax that Ukraine has reached in this war. But before starting, I wanted to tell you that I am Commander Robinson-Farinazzo, a Navy Reserve soldier, and this here is the Canal Arte da Guerra, a vehicle military, strategic, and geopolitical analysis carried out by professionals. So you who are arriving now, if you want to help us, subscribe to the channel, like, comment, share. If you want to give us super sticker or super chat, you help the YouTube algorithm promote us. That said, let's get to today's video. What happens is the following. There will be a summit now, right? A peace summit in Switzerland, which I already said started wrong because they didn't invite Russia. But they invited around 160 countries. Of these, 170 will attend. And countries that are extremely important to this process, such as Brazil, India, South Africa, will not send representatives. So what happens in the story? Now there's the aggravating factor, the icing on the cake. President Biden will not. So this summit is showing all the signs that Ukraine has already turned a corner, that many people are no longer giving importance to it, that President Biden has seen that he needs to take care of his life because he has an election here. We are at the end of May, so the election is in 180 days. So he has to think carefully what is most important to him. He has already decided that the most important thing is the election. That said, I think some minds, especially in the American Pentagon, must be tingling with the idea of the Vietnamization of Ukraine. What is Vietnamization? Vietnamization was a term, an expression created under President Nixon's government from 1969-70, in which they were going to transfer all operational control of the war to the South Vietnamese army. So what happened? They inflated the Vietnamese army from 500,000 to 1 million men. The Americans left all the equipment to them. They greatly reduced air operations. They withdrew troops from there. And we know how it ended. The South Vietnamese army was overcome by the North Vietnamese who unified the country. Now, in the case of Ukraine, there are some differences. There is no overt presence of American troops as there was in Vietnam. In Vietnam, there were 500,000 American soldiers in Ukraine. This is effectively not the case. But the fact is this. During Vietnamization, financial support and logistics in South Vietnam. So what happens in the end was the army, he had competence and they fought or he wasn't going to do anything else. That's what happened. I think it will hardly be possible for Ukraine this year. This year now, I think it is almost impossible. After the American elections, things will change. But it will be difficult for you to get another $60 billion package like the one they allocated to the Zelensky, right? And the Ukrainian army, without the money and weapons of the Americans and their allies, is in no condition to fight. This here is the truth. This is what effectively happened with South Vietnam. Then there was no more money they had a lot of weapons there, a lot of planes, armored vehicles, etc. But there was no fuel, no ammunition, a series of other things. So Ukraine is more or less on this path. Whether the decision will be taken in a formal way, we are not in a position to know. But this summit is a thermometer, a very strong indication that things are changing. And why is that? It's not just the problem of the American election. The whole problem is that Biden is fighting his campaign in Ukraine, the situation in Israel, which is not going well, but not well at all. Perhaps he is not in a situation of military debacle like Ukraine, the Israeli army. That's not the case. But there's a very complicated moral situation because international public opinion is falling on the country. That's one thing. And the other problem is the problem of Taiwan, in which the United States interfered whatever it wanted. This week, the Chinese tightened their siege against Taiwan. So it may be that in the future, I think it is unlikely, but we cannot rule out that China will try a military option against Taiwan. I'm not talking about an invasion, but they can blockade, they can do a series of other things there against the Taiwanese. And then the Americans will have to use resources. They won't be able to fight on these three fronts. There's Yemen too. We can't forget that. They won't be able to operate on these three fronts. So I think people are starting to disengage from Ukraine. They saw which one is worse of the three patients, which one is worse off. They said, let's leave it there. And they die then. It's a possibility. You see Vietnamization in Ukraine. What I need to remember is that the motto of Vietnamization is the following. It was peace with honor. Nixon vowed to establish peace with dignity for the U.S. There wasn't even peace because the fighting continued, and much less was American honor safeguarded because the United States emerged defeated. In the case of Ukraine, there's nothing to say.
Nah.
I think it's a problem, an elephant in the Ukrainian war room that no one can deny is the case with long-range weapons. This will be the biggest problem of this war. The biggest problem in this war will be these long-range weapons. Why? Because Russia will not be able to accept a condition of territorial cession to Ukraine, knowing that the Ukrainians have weapons that can threaten Western Russia. Another thing that Russia will also fight about is the regime change in Kiev. They are already insisting that the elements do not have legitimacy, so they will try everything they can to overthrow this government. So we have a very reasonable problem, I would say very complex. The problem is that on the other side of the table, we have a government that is known to be inept, which is the case with Biden. He will not be able to deal with this crisis. Can Trump change if he visits? Look, it might change. I think that Trump will face a very deteriorated situation in Ukraine. At this point, he is more practical and he will push her under the bus if this doesn't happen by then, right? If Biden himself doesn't do this in order to save his own election, that is what is at stake now. It's just that luckily for him, Netanyahu, unluckily, right? Netanyahu did so much nonsense that people in the United States and around the world have practically forgotten about Ukraine and are dealing more with Israel. So that if Biden disengaging from Ukraine, which it seems he has some intention of doing, there won't be any surprises. But the biggest problem, I think, is resources. He won't have the resources to take care of the three campaigns. He'll have to get rid of Ukraine. Furthermore, in military terms, there is no longer anything that can be done. Everyone knows Russia's superiority, both in the tactical and industrial logistics fields, and the West is no longer in a position to help Ukraine. In parallel, we have to remember that this war is destroying. It has already destroyed practically an entire generation of Ukrainians, so there is no other way out. Vietnamization in the United States generated some problems. There were mutinies in the American army, because no one wanted to die in a war that was already lost. There were increased cases of official attacks, etc. But I don't say mutiny, but it's the occasional attacks, the occasional fights during exercises, etc. But we have to remember that it was the only possible way out. Okay, leaving the Soviets to their own devices. After 50 years, nothing has changed. Ukrainians and Russians have to understand each other, left to their own devices to solve their problem. After all, they have been living there for over 1,000 years.